Well, hello, American National Government class. Today is Tuesday, March 24th, when I'm recording this. We're going to begin looking at chapters 13 and 14. Chapter 13 is the federal bureaucracy, and then chapter 14 is the courts. So I'm going to be sending you, obviously, the PowerPoint for this before or when I send you these videos, so you can take a look at them. But if you are in the PowerPoint for chapter 13 and slide number 2, talking about what bureaucracy is. Bureaucracy is simply a system of organization and control that is based on three principles: hierarchy, hierarchical authority. It's really hard to say that fast. Hierarchical authority, job specialization, and formalized rules. In other words, if you have a very, very complex governmental system, you have to have some form of bureaucracy. Basically, the goal of bureaucracy is efficiency in a very complex situation and scenario. That's the best way to go. And I've got some kind of funny cartoons there on slides number 3 and 4. You can take a look at them. I'm just poking at them. Again, my favorite is slide number 3, where a couple of explorers find a mummy, and they say, "Look, he's wrapped in red tape. We've discovered the first bureaucrat." All right. So if you think about bureaucrats and what's a bureaucrat, that word might be unfamiliar to you. Probably the best way I can explain it, if you've ever seen the movie Monsters Incorporated, my favorite character in that entire movie is the gal that's basically, she ends up being the secret agent, but basically she's the gal with glasses, and she says, "Hey, Wazowski, I'll be watching you, always watching you. Wazowski, you forgot to fill out your paperwork." Okay, in other words, if you've seen that movie, you know who I'm talking about, and we all laugh about that. But that's a good example. That's a caricature of a bureaucrat. Okay, somebody who's very concerned about, you didn't sign on the right line, you didn't fill out your paperwork for this or that. And if you think about it, when have you dealt with bureaucrats? Every one of you, at least that can drive, you've dealt with a bureaucrat. Every time you've gone to the DMV, right, to get a license or a license renewal or something like that, the person behind the counter is a bureaucrat. There are somebody that again, they are in the case of the DMV, they're within the Secretary of State's department within the state of Michigan and dealing with the Department of Motor Vehicles. Okay, so in other words, they process paperwork, and then they keep kind of a lot of the engines of government running. So bureaucracies are not a bad thing, but one of the things we're going to talk about in this chapter is the shifts that occurred in administrative government bureaucracy at the turn of the 20th century that has made a lot of administration within the federal government in particular unaccountable to the American people. Again, we'll develop that in a little bit here. But if you look at the next slide, slide number 5, it talks about that bureaucracy is inevitable. Again, once a government gets very complex and very large, you kind of have to do that. You have to have specialized rules and things like that. One of the challenges of bureaucrats and bureaucracies is they take what the textbook calls the agency point of view. And what that means is once they're appointed by a governor, in the case of the state of Michigan, or maybe a mayor in a local government, or a president in various agencies, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Health and Human Services, the FBI, what they tend to do is, instead of being loyal to that president or governor or mayor that appointed them, they'll become more loyal to that particular department they're in. That's this idea of the agency point of view. And again, this is one of the challenges. I think I talked about this in the previous series of lectures on the presidency, is energy in the executive is the leading character of good government, as Alexander Hamilton said in Federalist 70. And this idea of a president that appoints a bureaucrat to do what that president wants, if there's energy in the executive, what that president does is exactly, and the policy initiatives that president has is exactly what that bureaucrat will follow. The problem happens is when a president's going this way, and that bureaucrat, because of the agency point of view, is more beholden to or more loyal to that agency. Now you've got a problem. Again, this is where we get the idea of the swamp, okay, where you've got presidents that have bureaucrats under them that are not basically following the president's lead. I listened to an interview of President Obama, and that was one of his frustrations when he was in office, is a lot of these bureaucrats that were appointed or even weren't appointed by him because they were holdovers from the Bush administration. President Obama was going left, and these bureaucrats were going right. In other words, this is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This happens to both parties in the challenges of democracies. Agencies are subject to oversight by the president, by Congress, and the judiciary. But we're going to talk about kind of how all that works within this chapter. Hang in here one second. I just lost the slide I was just looking at because it reverted back to the president's election, which is kind of interesting. If you go to slide number 6, you can kind of see the structure of the federal bureaucracy. Originally, the federal bureaucracy was quite small. There was about 3,000 employees. Basically, originally, the federal government's constitutional role was confined largely to defense, foreign affairs, currency, interstate commerce, delivery of the mail. In fact, one of the very first bureaucratic agencies was mail. Okay, and so in the latter part of the 1800s, the bureaucracies began to grow. To a large degree, we're going to find out it's because of the progressive movement and their rejection of the Founders' Constitution. They began to see that administration that's disconnected from politics is a better way forward in complex governance. And again, I'm going to develop that in a little bit. But if you look at slide number 7, you can kind of see the development of this. I don't want to belabor the point, but one of the very first initiatives that grew the bureaucracy was farmers in the 1800s that asked for help. So the Department of Agriculture was developed. In 1903, Business and Labor developed again in response to a lot of the problems within business. Again, you think child labor. Think of unsafe business practices. Think of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, and the dangers of the meat packing industry, where you had the Food and Drug Administration that was developed. What was said of that time, and it later became kind of famous, this statement, there's 2 things you never want to see being made. Number 1 is sausage, and number 2, laws. And again, part of Upton Sinclair's book was there was all kinds of funky things found in the meat of that time. I don't want to get into how gross it was, but I had to read the book years ago in school, and yes, it was really that gross. A lot of the biggest spurts of bureaucratic agency growth happened in the New Deal in the 1930s. The argument was government must step in and help the little guy, so there was a lot of these agencies that were created. This further was enhanced in Lyndon Johnson's administration, the Great Society, where the federal government got involved in policy areas traditionally dominated by the states, such as transportation, the Department of Transportation, housing, that was traditionally a local or state government issue, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And so if you look at slides number 8 and 9, I'm showing actually 8, 9, and 10. This is a quote from a book that Woodrow Wilson wrote, and it talks about, again, Woodrow Wilson was one of the champions of administrative government. His thought was this: he thought that politics is ugly, politics is dirty, politics can be corrupt. And was politics corrupt in the 1800s? Yes, it was becoming that way. So he thought the way forward is if you can disconnect government from the muck and the mire of politics and replace politics with administration. In other words, instead of a politician running the government, you have unelected bureaucrats who are highly skilled, highly educated, highly trained. They're not elected. They cannot be removed from office. The logic was they're going to be neutral. The logic was they're going to be competent because they're highly trained, highly educated. They're going to be very, very neutral. And so they're going to do a better job of governing people than politicians, because again, you've got to pander to interest groups, there's partisanship, there's all kinds of bias. In the logic of Wilson, there was no bias in administrative government. If you think of administrative government, that the progressives initiated. Think of your a city manager. Again, I live in Bridgman, and Bridgman does have a mayor, but that is a part-time position. There's a full-time city manager. This individual is appointed by the city council, but that individual is not elected. That individual cannot be removed from office. And again, the logic is they're neutral, so they're not going to be conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat. They're just going to kind of get the job done for government. That's the logic. Think of your local school superintendent. Same idea. The local school superintendent and the city manager came about because of the progressive movement in the 1900s. So let's take a look here at this quote from the Study of Administration that Wilson wrote in 1886. And he's talking about, again, where did this come from? Where did I get this idea of administration? Okay, because the founders, they made provision for presidents and the executive branch to create executive departments, but administration was not supposed to be the be-all and end-all of the federal government. Elected representatives by the people, the people's representatives, again, Republican government, small r, was meant to be the dominating force in our federal government. So Wilson, what's really refreshing about him is he's very transparent, and he tells us where he got this idea. Again, he's candid. He said, I did not get it from the founders and the founders' constitution. He got it somewhere else. And basically what he says is, I got it from Europe. He says, but where is this science grown up? Again, science administration. Surely not on this side of the sea. Not much impartial scientific method is to be discerned in our administrative practices. The poisonous atmosphere of city government, the crooked secrets of state administration, the confusion, sinecuraism, and corruption ever and ever discovered in the bureaus in Washington forbid us to believe that any clear conceptions of what constitutes good administration are widely current in the United States. Again, in his thinking, politics gums up the works. Politics is ugly, dirty, corrupt. No, American writers have hitherto taken no very important part in this advancement of this science. It is found in the doctors of Europe. In other words, he's looking over to France, he's looking over to Germany, he's looking over to governments that are more socialistic in their polity for a way to transplant that into the United States. It is not of our making, it's a foreign science, speaking very little of the language of English or American principle. It has been developed by French and German professors. It is consequently in all parts adapted to the needs of the compact state and made to fit highly centralized forms of government. In other words, he's very candid. Centralized governments, like socialized governments, and later on, again, the largest centralized government in the world, and that would have been the Soviet Union, are uniquely created to have a group of administrators that are basically pulling the levers of government beyond the politicians. He says, we can borrow the science of administration with safety and profit if only we read all the fundamental differences of condition into its essential tenets. We have only to filter it through our constitutions, only to put it over a slow fire of criticism and distill away its foreign gases. I know that there is a sneaking fear in some conscientiously patriotic minds. Who's he talking about? People that are basically have allegiance to the founders' constitution. He said there's a sneaking fear in those kind of people that European systems might signal some foreign methods over American methods, which in a sense is really true. And so again, the final slide there, he said the field of administration is a field of business. It is removed from the hurry and the strife of politics. It is at most points, it stands apart from the debatable ground of constitutional study. In other words, he's saying it's not in the Constitution. You can spend many fruitless hours looking for it throughout the Constitution. You won't find it. It's not there. The object of administrative study is to rescue executive methods, again, the executive branch, whether it's the presidency or whether it's a governor or whether it's a mayor. The object of administrative study is to rescue executive methods from the confusion and costliness of empirical experiment and set them on foundations deep and stable principle. Administrative lies outside the sphere of politics. Administrative questions are not political questions. Although politics sets the tasks for administration, it should not be suffered to manipulate its offices. Now think about that. If administrators, if bureaucrats are not to be manipulated by politicians. Again, politicians are connected to the people and the will of the people. So Wilson is saying disconnect, sever administrative bureaucrats from politics, if you catch what he's saying, sever bureaucrats from the will of the people. Okay? So in other words, the very danger of bureaucrats going rogue is possible here. Okay, Wilson didn't worry about that for a couple of reasons. Number one, because there was a changing conception of human nature. You had, at this time, Wilson was a proponent of the social gospel, which basically argued that people are basically good and you can further the kingdom of God through government. So there was a lot of optimism, almost utopianism going on in America in the 1890s, early 1900s. So that was number one. Number two, he really thought that that bureaucrats would be neutral. If you remove them from politics, they'd be neutral. He thought they would be very competent, in fact, a lot more competent than an elected official. Think of somebody with a PhD in economics compared to your rank and file politician. And he thought that because of all those reasons, they would do a better job. So again, I'm gonna end this here because we've got about 15, 16 minutes into this, and I will pick this up with slide number 11. So talk to you soon. Take care.